So I think we'll go ahead and get started if everyone's about ready. All right. Good morning. I'm Catherine Ingrassia, Interim Dean of the College of Humanities and Sciences, and I'm so pleased to see so many of you here and to welcome everyone to the 2022 Elske v.P. Smith Distinguished Lecture. Every year, the College of Humanities and Sciences selects an outstanding faculty member to deliver a lecture to the VCU community about their area of expertise. The lecture annually highlights the academic excellence in all disciplines throughout the college, and today we are so lucky to have Dr. Andrew Murphy, formerly from the Department of Political Science, as our 2022 speaker. Before I introduce Dr. Murphy, I'd like to say a few words about Dr. Elske Smith, the namesake of this lecture, whose gift makes our time today possible. Dr. Smith was a professor of physics and dean of the College of Humanities and Sciences from 1980 until 1992. She was a solar physicist whose research examines the active regions on the sun, especially flares and pages, solar chromosphere, interstellar polarization, and solar physics. A fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and a member of the International Astronomical Union and American Astronomical Society, Dr. Smith was also a founding member and first treasurer of the AAS Solar Physics Division. She wrote 2 books, Solar Flares and Introductory Astronomy and Astrophysics. And she also served as the director of VCU's Center for Environmental Studies from 1992 until 1995. Besides her time at VCU, Dr. Smith worked at the University of Maryland, Sacramento Peak Observatory, and the Goddard Space Flight Center at NASA. In 1995, Dr. Smith retired from VCU. Even in this abbreviated form, this impressive CV demonstrates that Dr. Smith was a scholar of great achievement. I had the opportunity to meet her only once during my on-campus visit to VCU in what was Dr. Smith's final semester as dean. Needless to say, she cut a very formidable and somewhat imposing figure, especially for a graduate student hoping to land a first job. I'd like to thank Dr. Smith for her generosity and continued support of the college and her vision in creating this lecture. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker. Until this semester, Andrew Murphy was a professor in the Department of Political Science at VCU. He now is a professor at the University of Michigan, and we are absolutely delighted that he's come back to deliver his lecture today. Dr. Murphy studies the emergence of religious liberty and liberty of conscience in early modern England and America, and explores the ongoing ramifications of these debates as they continue to unsettle American politics. His scholarship spans varied historical periods. His work focuses on early modern England and America, and including, most recently, 2 monographs on William Penn, A Life, published in 2019, and Liberty, Conscience, and Toleration, The Political Thought of William Penn. He's also co-edited a collection, The Worlds of William Penn. His other books include, I'm going to give you the whole list because I want you to know how fabulous Dr. Murphy is, Conscience and Community, Revisiting Toleration and Religious Dissent in Early Modern England and America, Political Religion and Religious Politics, Navigating Identities in, so the title's so long that it's gone off my screen. Navigating Identities in the United States, and Prodigal Nation, Moral Decline and Divine Punishment from New England to 9/11. Currently, Dr. Murphy is working on a project that explores the concept of political martyrdom and the ways the study of politically charged deaths help us make sense of the complex interplay of death, collective memory, and symbolic power, all of which he will explore in today's lecture. Before I ask you to join me in welcoming Dr. Murphy, for those of you who are in Professor Mesner's and Crenshaw's mass communications class, the sign-up sheet for you will be available in the back of the room after the lecture. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Andrew Murphy.
Thank you very much for that introduction. It's so great to be back. It's so great to see so many familiar faces in the crowd. There will be neither William Penn nor solar flares in the next 40 minutes, I promise, or I'm sorry, one or the other. But it is great to be here, and it's great to be in person, to feel like we can start to do this again. Is there anyone here from Dr. Bargdill's research team? Not sure if they Well, I got this wonderful email yesterday from Professor Argil in the psych department, and apparently there's a research team working on the concept of ecological martyrs. So this is in the air. As you see on the screen behind me, the iconic representations of Ahmaud Arbery, who died in February of 2020, Breonna Taylor, who died in March 2020, and George Floyd, of course, in May 2020. The kind of iconic representation of these particular individuals kind of gets at, I think, the heart of what I want to talk about today. George Floyd and Ashli Babbitt died just over 7 months apart. Floyd in late May 2020 on a Minneapolis street corner, and Babbitt on January 6th as she attempted to enter the lobby, the speaker's lobby at the Capitol building. These deaths were seized upon by numerous groups across the nation. Much of the commentary about both Floyd and Babbitt invoked the imagery of martyrdom as symbolic, these deaths as somehow symbolic to the political divisions of our time. And so this morning I want to talk a little bit about these two deaths and this larger concept of political martyrdom that I've been studying. Now, not surprisingly, in the polarized nation in which we live, claims and counterclaims about martyrdom in the cases of Floyd and Babbitt quickly themselves became indicative of the polarization we are living with. Attempts to frame them as martyrs drew swift pushback from political commentators and public figures. I'm looking at it this way on my screen, but it's actually over here, sorry. Candace Owens remarked in June 2020, "I do not support George Floyd and the media depiction of him as a martyr for Black America," stressing Floyd's, quote, "long and dangerous rap sheet," and describing him as, quote again, "a violent criminal his entire life." Owens flatly stated George Floyd was not an amazing person. Implication here, martyrs are amazing people. He's not an amazing person, therefore he's not a martyr. At the other end of the political spectrum, in the aftermath of January 6th, many right-wing groups hailed Babbitt as a martyr. You saw the call for a Million Martyr March. It never actually happened, but it was called for the Biden inauguration day. Yet, in a nation as polarized as ours, it's no surprise, I think, that posthumous attention on Babbitt also provoked criticism. As we neared the one-year anniversary of the January 6th events, journalists started probing Babbitt's personal history, uncovering evidence of a checkered past, including marital infidelity, promotion of conspiracy theories, assault, and social media rants. She rammed someone with a car, apparently, whose spouse she was having an affair with. The Associated Press invoked her biography to undercut claims to her martyr status. As we see here in the headline, Ashli Babbitt, a martyr, question mark. Her past tells a more complex story. Again, implication, someone's past and how we evaluate that past determines whether or not they are a martyr. Each of these critiques, I think, echo a widespread notion about martyrdom, that it's some kind of moral status akin to virtue or heroism, and that in some way it depends on the individual's moral character. And I want to take issue with this this morning. So I'm hardly the first to point out parallels between Babbitt and Floyd. Sorry. I saw some students out here, and so I've got things I was teaching. Floyd, that would be what Freud would call a Freudian slip somehow, but that would take us somewhere else. Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene said, if this country can demand justice for someone like George Floyd, against someone like George Floyd, sort of its own kind of disparagement, then we can certainly demand justice for Ashli Babbitt. You see here the Anti-Defamation League reports that the references online to Babbitt as the white man's George Floyd, even the supporters of Babbitt even tried to get a chance of say her name at rallies. and Say Your Name, of course, goes back to the death of Sandra Bland and Breonna Taylor, Black victims of police violence. So this is, of course, an ongoing and a very contentious attempt to appropriate or undermine the memory of these individuals. So what I want to do today, I want to think a little bit about the notion of political martyrdom. I mean, martyrdom is always political, so this may run the risk of redundancy, but talk a little bit about political martyrdom, its core components, the vehicles by which it's communicated, and the various ways in which communities invest death with political significance, consecrate it, and then enshrine it in their collective memory, where it resides as a resource for political mobilization, identity formation. So there are three sort of questions here. First of all, and you see them on the screen, given the origins of the term martyr in the notion of witness, which I'll talk about in just a minute, to what do these two deaths, Floyd and Babbitt, witness? How do these narratives relate to the contemporary crisis, or crises perhaps, of confidence in American civic institutions? And how might directing our attention to political martyrdom inform our understanding of the promise and the dangers to American democracy in the 21st century? I got about a half an hour, so I'm not going to answer all of these questions. I hope that won't disappoint anyone. But what I want to do is I want to back up a little bit and talk a little bit about martyrdom more generally, and then we'll get around, come back to Babbitt and Floyd at the end. So the term martyr, its etymology, comes from the Greek term for witness, one who bears testimony to something, either in a legal courtroom setting or more generally, something that is known by their own experience. Those of you who know the Islamic tradition or know your Arabic will know that the word shaheed also has a similar kind of etymology and also appears in a lot of the discussion and discourse in the Islamic tradition. The Christian origins of the term established a kind of template or a model of what martyrs look like. And you can see this in this fantastic image here of the Christian martyrs being tossed to the lions by the Romans. And the classic accounts generally contain a series of elements. Resolute resistance to state authority, refusal to recant or sacrifice to the emperor, even despite offers of clemency or threats, bravery in the face of torture and certain death, and then ultimately celebration by the church as examples of faithfulness. In all these cases, witnesses martyrs are witnesses who attempt to direct the audience's attention to the thing that they're witnessing to. And you can see the sort of the uplifted gaze here of the Christian martyr, sort of a heavenly gaze. But I want to actually move away from the kind of martyrdom that we get in sort of the world's religious traditions. It's important, and it's the source of a lot of the academic work on this topic. But I want to talk about a different kind of martyrdom. I want to talk about a martyrdom that is distinct from religious traditions, martyrdom that offers a kind of immortality to dead individuals, not by promising them eternal life. Certainly the expectation of this martyr here is that he is going to very shortly be joining his God and live forever. And I'm not here to say he isn't. It's just the witnessing aspect of martyrdom as to the truth of Christianity and the eternal life that would follow from dying for one's faith. Here we have Chico Mendes, who's an Amazonian environmental activist shot by ranchers in 1988. Anna Politkovskaya, who's a Russian journalist, exposed atrocities in the Chechen War and was assassinated in Moscow in 2006, and of course, Abraham Lincoln. So a political martyr, as I understand it, attains a kind of immortality, not by entering into paradise or eternal life, but by gaining a place in a community's enduring collective memory. It's a similar process. Individual death is taken to be a means of witnessing to something larger than itself. And again, we'll get to Floyd and Babbitt at the end, we'll come back around to them. But what we're talking about in this case is not so much divine truths, but rather sort of the identity of a community. This is less, I think, about a voluntary decision to sacrifice one's life, and much more about what happens after death. I think this is sort of one of the key points that I always sort of try to insist on, is the most, in some ways, the least important aspect of martyrdom is the death itself. Where the real action is, pardon the phrase, where the real action is what happens to that memory after death. So that's what we're going to be spending a lot of time with. So let me talk then about the three elements or stages of political martyrdom. I'll run through these rather quickly, come back around to Floyd, and leave some time for you to offer your own thoughts, because this is very much a work in progress. So as I see it, there are three stages or components to political martyrdom. First is the death. These deaths generally take place in what we might call unnatural circumstances, generally connected to an individual's identity or political commitments, often involving the exercise of violence by the state or other community members, or even the martyrs themselves. So there's death. And the death provides an opportunity for the consecration of that death. In other words, removing that death from the sphere of the mundane or the everyday and investing it with broader meaning, framing it as witnessing or pointing to something beyond itself. There is, sadly, of course, there's death all around us. People die all the time. But there are certain deaths that are taken up by communities and charged with this kind of symbolic significance. And then thirdly, the repeated commemoration or transmission of those memories down across time, temporal division. So to be successful, to be complete, these consecrated martyr narratives have to be transmitted over time, which generally takes place through commemoration practices and so on. Let me talk just a little bit more about each of these stages, and then we'll move back to Floyd and Babbitt. One of the most widespread, and those of you who know me will know that I had to get the Irish hunger strikers in here at some point. They're near and dear to my Irish-American heart. One of the most long-standing pieces of the scholarship on martyrdom, if you go into it and start at the beginning and work your way up, is this idea that to be a martyr, it requires an intentional or a voluntary decision to seek death. And these are just a few brief little snippets from academic treatments of martyrdom. Elective deaths, intentional decision, considered choice. In an extremely hostile situation, a martyr prefers a violent death to compliance with the demand of authorities. There's a kind of a template out there that a martyr is a kind of heroic individual from an oppressed group who stands up on principle, knowing full well that they are facing death. But I think this actually is not necessarily faithful to the actual accounts of what happened to a lot of people that we all would probably assume pretty safely were martyrs. There are some people, of course, who do choose consciously to pursue death. There's this wonderful street graffiti, Le Martyr of Bouazizi. Bouazizi was the Tunisian street vendor whose self-immolation helped spark the Arab Spring. And you see him there being lifted up as a martyr. Again, these Irish hunger strikers, the hunger strike is really an extreme example of this. And you have to intentionally decide every day to continue with your pursuit of death. But there are a lot of other people who I think we would all kind of agree are martyrs, engage in behaviors that make death possible, perhaps likely, but not certain. King would be a great example. His famous mountaintop speech delivered literally the day before he was assassinated. He said very clearly, I want to live a long life. Longevity is good. But yet he knew that his actions were putting him in danger and had for quite some time. So it's not really accurate to say he chose death or he sought out death, but he was willing to accept the risk of death in order to pursue the policies and the movement that meant so much to him. Then we have people for whom death occurs in the course of going about their routine activities. Think about George Floyd going to the corner store, Breonna Taylor sitting on the couch in her boyfriend's apartment or her own apartment. So I think that the notion that unchosen deaths are somehow not martyrdoms kind of oversimplifies things. And in fact, if we get rid of this idea that you have to choose to be a martyr in order to be one, it can allow us, I think, to think much more broadly about the way politics and death come together. Think about, for example, the folks, the individuals memorialized in the AIDS quilt as a kind of politicized death that bears witness to apathy and homophobia at the highest levels of American government. Think about perhaps the opioid epidemic and so on. So I want to sort of push away from the idea that knowing whether someone, intentionally decided to seek death, that to me is much less important. These are, again, important biographical information to know perhaps, but maybe not quite so important, because like I said, what I think really matters and where the real interesting stuff happens is what happens after the death and how communities take up certain deaths and pose them as fundamentally significant to their understanding of who they are. So consecration, it's a term we often see with relation to churches, temples, mosques, and so on, and the rituals that are done in those places. But I want to sort of again detach a little bit from the specifically religious context and talk about consecration as a process that marks a death as holding a particularly significant place in a community's history and its identity. And there's actually some really interesting sociological work being done on this topic, describing consecration as a social process involving interpretation and reinterpretation of the life of a particular figure, elevating that figure symbolically to sacred status, to making the memory of particular individuals sacred. And what it does is it affords the consecrated individual a place in the community's central narratives. Who are we as a people? What are our fundamental qualities, values, and how does this particular death somehow give us insight into who we are? Now, because this is wrapped up with death, I think it's not surprising that a lot of the beginning stages of this process happen around funeral rituals or memorial services or ways in which death is sort of ritually enacted and reenacted. So what happens here, again, to repeat what I said a minute ago, a death is removed from the sphere of the mundane and invested through the community's actions with broader, transcendent, transhistorical, choose your word, a cultural and symbolic meaning. This is a conflicted, a conflictual, a contentious, and often violent process, because the world we live in is filled with communities that find themselves in conflicted, conflictual, contested, and sometimes violent relationships with each other. We see here on the slide, this is George Floyd's funeral at the top. I believe that's the one in Houston. There were several, so I don't know exactly. Sorry. This is Bobby Sands in 1981, the first IRA hunger striker. 100,000 people came out to line the funeral, and of course, filled with symbolism, the Irish flag on top of the coffin, and the IRA honor guard escorting the procession. This, the bottom here is the funeral of Wafa Idris, who was the first female suicide bomber martyr in the the second Intifada. Here, of course, not to be too gruesome, but there was no body. She detonated herself with a explosive backpack. So there was an empty, you might be able to see it there, I think just behind. There was an empty pine coffin, but thousands of people came out, despite the fact that it was barely legal to gather. So this process of consecration really kicks off, I think, when the dead individual, relatives, friends, community supporters come out, and it becomes a kind of way of testifying to the significance of the death for the community. So that's sort of the early stages. Now, finally, the third stage here is what I call commemoration or transmission. As I said, to be successful, this has to be not simply, you have to have more than simply the moment of the funeral, of course. You need to have those memories reinforced, transmitted over time, and commemorated. I just said, often this takes place through media vehicles, rituals, commemorative processes, and it's important, I think, to recognize that we're talking not simply about our individual memories of particular persons, but the community as a kind of repository of collective memory, because memory, none of us have purely individualized memories. Our memories are shaped, you're just giving a passage here, shaped, situated in social frameworks. We all come from somewhere, we all are located somewhere, enabled by changing technologies, confronted with cultural institutions, and shaped by political circumstances. So the memory of individuals is not simply, it doesn't live in an isolated way inside each of our heads, but also lives in sort of the communal spaces that we all inhabit. Now this is, I'm happy to bring this to this group, especially, give you an example. The notion of commemoration, the notion of the transmission of memory is never a neutral or a passive practice, if we ever thought that. Anyone who lived through these moments will certainly, oh, in fact, Ryan Smith's Smith lecture last year, if you didn't see it, still, hopefully it's available somewhere. I highly recommend it, about Richmond cemeteries. I would recommend that too, because he's very much talking about this process. Political actors in the present rework and reimagine historical figures and episodes, and communities, of course, are never monolithic. The idea that everyone thought Lee was fine when he went up, but then something happened. It's much more complicated than that. I had the great good fortune to take this picture. And many of you maybe were out there as well, watching the crane come and bidding him well, I almost said a fond farewell, just a farewell. How about that? And these are all, these relationships of power are at work in these, in all these instances. So memory is not simply a matter of retrieving something from the past, but it's an active, constructive process. So this obviously is a big example. Well, I was going to ask what happened to the space, but we can talk about that later. So some other ways in which this happens. Maybe the most straightforward way is simply the account of saints' lives. The Fox's Book of Martyrs was for years sort of like the Protestant Bible of Catholic evil, all the people that they put to death and all the horrible ways they put them to death. But there's of course a lot more to it than that. We have famous Paul Revere drawing of the Boston Massacre. We have Charles I. Charles I is back in the news these days, in case you haven't noticed, since the new king took his name. Well, his name was Charles, and he kept it. Charles I lost his head, literally, and part of the construction of Charles I as a martyr after his execution in 1649 involved this sort of this woodcut, this picture of him looking kind of like Jesus in the garden. And there's all kinds of interesting things about the crown of thorns he has in his hand. So, and then of course, Charles II actually died peacefully in his bed. So it's not necessarily a curse to take the name Charles as if you're a king, but it's a 50% chance at this point. So you might not want to roll the dice. And this, of course, you may know, this is Marcus David Peters, after whom the site of the Lee Monument was renamed. So often we have oral narratives that are written down, paired with visual imagery. We also have sort of ritual commemorative practices. This is the reburial of Imre Nagy in Hungary in 1989. Nagy was the leader of Hungary during the 1956 uprising. India has Martyrs' Day, which includes both dead soldiers and Gandhi. So they want to sort of cover all different forms of violence or nonviolence. And then there are, of course, media portrayals. Raul Julius Romero, assassinated archbishop who spoke up against the regime in El Salvador in the 1980s. So there's a whole bunch of obviously different ways in which this, and this I think is really where you see, and where we're going to see the continuing ramifications of the cases that we're talking about. The degree to which these memories are not simply consecrated, but are transmitted and commemorated is a measure of the success of a martyr becoming sort of ensconced in a community's memory. So let's go just quickly to a few last things here. A lot of even very sympathetic observers were reluctant to call George Floyd a victim, partly because, like what I was talking about a few minutes ago, he didn't make a decision to die. He was trying to just simply go to the store, right? Ernest Owens, who's a writer for the Philadelphia Magazine, said he wasn't killed for his belief in racial justice. He made no deliberate choice. He didn't wake up that morning to sacrifice himself. He was not a martyr who was killed for his belief in racial justice, but rather a man who'd been murdered by a police officer. And this is very interesting to me because the way my mind works is you could be both. You could be a man who was murdered by a police officer, and you could be a martyr, though whether you're killed for a belief or simply because an aspect of your identity, maybe it's a different question. It's not clear whether Ashli Babbitt, she intentionally stormed the Capitol. It's not clear whether she intentionally sought her own death. So I came across a really interesting use of the term unintentional martyr by a writer named Micah Green, writing in Afro News. Floyd as an unintentional martyr. And she writes, he never had his mountaintop moment. Never had a moment to stop and reflect on his life. Never had a moment to do more than simply find himself on the street corner where he found himself. And so this idea that martyrdom can find people in these kinds of ways, I think is quite powerful. Now, so that's the death part. The consecration part. The consecration of Ashli Babbitt began very soon after the January 6th events. This is apparently the Babbitt flag with the blood red capital behind her head. Within days, you see also the say her name that was so controversial hashtag. Within days, there were calls for Million Militia March, Million Martyr March, both which were planned for the day of the Biden inauguration. Didn't actually happen, but you can see sort of the dynamics here. The Babbitt martyr flag was available on eBay apparently on January 7th, so they wasted no time. With regard to Floyd, again, some of us may have been fortunate enough to actually see this in person. And what you're saying is not simply counterposing Floyd with Lee, which is its own sort of powerful symbolism, but also, again, sort of lifting up a particular death as containing, not to overshadow other deaths, not to diminish the importance of other deaths, but simply to say that there is something about this death that marks it as somehow indicative of the fundamental issues in our community. Even more interesting, I think, perhaps, is this straight Christian iconography, like Michelangelo's Pietà of Floyd over here, called Mama, which were, of course, some of his last words. Now, I have less to say maybe about the commemoration of Floyd and Babbitt because it's very much still underway. The corner where Floyd was killed has been sort of envisioned and reimagined, and this is very much still ongoing as a kind of memorial space and there's a website you can go to and have a look at the plans and so on. And there he is. President Trump at the time called in to an Ashli Babbitt rally in Texas on her birthday. And certainly what he says here, I call on the DOJ to reopen the investigation into her death. That hasn't happened, obviously, but I can assure you that if the Republicans do take control of the House in November, you are going to see this sort of ongoing reinvestigation of those events, and that will surely kind of continue we'll see these kinds of processes continuing to work themselves out. So if martyrdom is witness, then what do the deaths of these two people bear witness? I think this is not going to be anything radically ingenious on my part. But of course, the death of Floyd is inseparable from conversations about the nation's failure to live up to its own rhetoric about equality, inseparable from the toxic discussions and controversy and attempts to understand the toxic combination of white supremacy and police brutality. With regard to the death of Babbitt, again, it's not rocket science. Though if Elske Smith were here, she would probably be able to help me with rocket astronomy. Babbitt's death in discussions of Babbitt's death are inseparable from the events leading up to January 6th, the claims about stolen election, claims about lawsuits attempting to contest the results, and really a violent attempt to prevent the certification of those results. And more fundamentally, I think, a series of racialized conspiracy claims about the deep state and election fraud, and so on. So my point, so just to sort of sum up these sort of reflections on Floyd and Babbitt, implicit in what I'm saying is that the meanings of George Floyd's death and the meanings of Ashli Babbitt's death are not simply contained in what happened on May 20th or January 6th. We need to move the time parameters in both directions, move it back to see the kinds of community dynamics and power relations that led to those people getting to that place where they met their death, and then move it forward to see the way in which the memory of those deaths is continually struggled over, argued over, commemorated, and so on. And communities make these meanings in ways that assign or assert a larger significance to an individual episode. Okay, let me just wrap up here. And then I'd be delighted to hear your thoughts. So what I've been suggesting is that the processes that make up political martyrdom are inherently collective processes. We may think of Floyd, Babbitt, individual, Martin Luther King, and so on. But the process of martyrdom is hardly individual. It's a collective process, and it is a conflictual process. Because as we know, one person's martyr is someone else's terrorist, and vice versa. Now, attempts to deny martyr status to Floyd or Babbitt, or more generally, you see this a lot in the scholarship, Islamic, quote unquote, Islamic terrorists, they're not really martyrs. They just say they are. We should understand this very much as a political move, which is part of a longer tradition of boundary policing. This goes way back to St. Augustine in the 4th, 3rd century. He had this famous Latin phrase, non poenus sed causa, means basically, look, just because you're punished doesn't mean you're a martyr. You have to be punished for the right thing. And if you're punished for being a heretic or a troublemaker or a criminal, you can't claim to be a martyr. I want to sort of get away from that. I think we need to get rid of the notion of fake martyrs. These are all just words that pop up in the scholarship. Fake martyrs, false martyrs, manufactured martyrs, because all martyrs are manufactured. So the difference between Floyd and Babbitt, I would say, isn't that one's a martyr and the other isn't. Have my preferences, but beside the point, the difference between Floyd and Babbitt, I think, lies in the different causes that have consecrated their memories into the service of political conflict. So it requires us understanding that there is a significant community around each of these people that I have to say with sincerity, I have no reason to think either side is not sincere, sees in those deaths something powerful and fundamental and symbolic. We sort of reckon with the fact that this is another sort of symbolic evocation of the kinds of political conflicts that we are in the process of living through. And so I think this is not going to end anytime soon, and that these two individuals and the causes and the supporters that they have and that continue to embrace them are going to continue to struggle, not simply over the symbolic stuff of who's a martyr, but also over very practical and contentious political issues well into the future. I think I'll stop there and ask for questions. Say a little more about what you. Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting. I think that someone asked me, are there certain kinds of lives that lend themselves to martyrdom? And I think I understand completely what you're saying, that someone who is simply going to the store for cigarettes, whatever it was that George Floyd was doing, and finds themselves, murdered by a police officer. There's a kind of stark horror to that, right? On the other hand, you have people who, so there's something about that. On the other hand, you often find people saying, you know what, something's really powerful when someone knows full well that they're going to be put to death. Sort of, again, the classic Christians being thrown to the lions or whatever. So I think that it may depend on the particular community. It may depend on sort of the way it goes, death goes down. So I think that what's really interesting, and your questions have been thinking of all different things, is that almost any death, I think I would assert this. I'm going to go ahead and assert it. What the heck? Back at VCU. Let's assert something. Any death is a potential martyrdom, right? If it's taken, you might think of someone who dies age 75, it's asleep in their bed. Well, I don't know, but that would be the hard case. But what it really requires is a group of people resonating with the memory of that individual. And so to your point, there may be particular people or communities that will resonate particularly well with a certain type of death that is unintentional, comes out of the blue, comes out of nowhere, and is just tragic in ways that people see something powerful in it. But then for other groups, they may be very different. So I think that you're onto something, but I think it also will depend a lot on the particular kind of communities that are out there, sort of watching the world around them. Oh, yes. Hmm? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I should say this. When you start studying martyrdom, you realize that the Christian martyr tradition, I mean, that's where a lot of our thinking about what a martyr looks like and how they comes from sort of the scholarship. So I don't mean to say that I'm uninterested in it, but what I do want to do, I think, and I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, so let me know, is to say that there's a particular kind of profile that comes out of that tradition, and it looks kind of like the folks in the arena, right? So when you see a picture like this, you can imagine what came before. You can imagine that somewhere there was a ritual that was required for sacrificing to the emperor. These people probably refused to do it, or else their neighbors told on them or something, and they were hauled before a judge, and the judge said, "Are you a Christian?" And there's a certain shape of the martyr narrative. Are you a Christian? Yes. Will you recant? No. Then maybe they were whipped and so on, and then eventually they ended up here. And that's certainly one trajectory. But I think that when we think about individuals or groups that we think of as martyrs, they don't all necessarily track that way. So to the extent that there is still this kind of idea and these kinds of folks sort of making these kinds of art, and certainly Christians are persecuted this way in some places, and other religions are persecuted this way in other places. So it's not that it's gone away, but I think it's an overly narrow way of understanding what's going on. But you're absolutely right that, well, what's interesting is with Babbitt, the most religious folks, the more they find out about, this gets back to the question of whether your biography can undermine a martyr, because she was not a religious person. And yet the cause, of course, is heavily shot through with religion. Does that answer your question? Or, oh, okay, sure, yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Stolen election, legal government, like, I think that most, I'll assume that those are not real. Like, in a way that police brutality is real, and I know it's problematic, the word real, but like, it feels like if you don't have plots movement, if you don't have this giant alternative media universe, Ashli that's just somebody that got shot and they can
Can the two colonial web drivers please come down to the main office? Thank you.
Wow. Okay, so so let me say one thing. I'm highly sympathetic to what you just said. Okay, that there must be something. I want to agree with you, but here's why. If there's no God, are these people just dead people? Right? I mean, if it's not, like you're saying, it's not true. So what might be the difference is if the election wasn't really stolen, she gave her life, being hoodwinked by forces. If there's no God, is she just then the same as these folks if there's no God? Why, you're shrugging. I mean, you asked me the question. Yeah. Yeah. Well,
whereas, I think that one of the things that's interesting to think about is the way that the insistence on being balanced is one of the things that is deeply problematic about media narratives. Like, I think that when people say that we live in polarized times, like, or is there one media complex to people that want to polarize everything, or most people just want to go to the store and go to work and live their lives, right? I think that's, I don't know if it's sincerity, that's the thing. Like, is that like selling the abstract flag?
well, there's probably some of each. But so I like I said, I want to agree with you. I want there to be a story where my side is the sincere side and the other side is the huckster side. It would make me feel better, and it would make me feel vindicated in some way. But I'm just hesitant. There may well be hucksters and people who don't believe any of this, absolutely. But there may be, and then you have people who are on sort of the front lines, actually streaming into the Capitol.
Can the two colonial web drivers please come down to the information?
So I completely see what you're saying, but I'm also just a little reluctant because it makes it easy for me, and it lets me tell a story where my side gets to be the balanced side, and the other side has all the hucksters and the propagandists. Yeah, no, it's a great question. All right. Sure, no, you can draw all kinds of lines, absolutely. Yeah. Any students have a question? I'm sorry, my faculty colleagues here. All right, Tia, go ahead. Oh, you both had your hand.
Okay, so basically, I mean, where to your point, I
Mhm.
think the thing that comes to my mind too is this comparison is really like the martyrdom.
Mhm.
It doesn't seem like it's. And also, like, if you ignore that power relationship, one was murder by a government institution, while the other was violence against that government.
I was murdered by an officer of the Capitol Police.
Which is, but it's the action, so like by not using getting from the action, you're missing the fact that one person was doing their daily thing, and the other person was actively, committing a crime against government institutions. And then, so this is like just for the racial, political climate, this is just the United States. How can a group that benefits from democracy, so someone like Trump, who's like a good democratic process, really say, hold Babbitt up and just think as a martyr? And I think that's the piece of it. I can't get my mind wrapped around the idea that there are, you can make
Does it-
a martyr, but there's martyrs in the case, and that's not.
Does it matter whether Trump believes the election was stolen from him?
No, because it's the idea that. So with the Flint thing, right?
Mhm.
It's this idea that you're not benefiting from the things.
Yeah, and so I see the way you're, my hesitation is also, is similar to my hesitation before, which is that there's a story in which the people who exercise good faith are the ones that I find myself drawn to. And the ones who don't have good faith are all on the other side. And those kinds of, that is comforting to me, but it also makes me distrust myself.
That I think when you compare, the racial dynamics have to be addressed.
Right. Well, I think that what I really want to understand is the processes by which these various sub-communities raise up these individuals. I'm much less interested, maybe I should be more interested, but I'm less interested maybe in evaluating the appropriateness of this. There's a process going on. The process is a similar process. And if I were engaged in an attempt to sort of talk politically about which one or the other I particularly felt was more worthy of admiration or whatever, then I think these kinds of questions would be. But I also think that there are groups of people for whom folks that I find quite unpleasant and benefiting from all sorts of problematic things. The cultural processes are similar processes. So that's sort of where I go back to. Yeah, Amanda was.
Where you have pieces of repression, where it's like must be in order to protest against this action. In the American case, what's been criticized is that like the martyrs that we have in American politics, these modern American politics, are martyrs. So I'm thinking again, what is the dynamic in ritual politics that requires martyrs? Why is this a mainstay of our?
Well, I would say there's something about, not only is death a powerful thing, but there's something about concrete individual examples that are elevated in such a way that they are taken to embody something really fundamental to. So, for example, like Floyd, right? This is not simply a random death. It's not even a rare death. That's part of the problem, right? But something about it is taken to highlight or provide a window into a much larger and messier reality that somehow all kind of comes down to this particular individual kind of shows us something about ourselves. So I think it may be the case, and then what it shows us is not simply locked in the past, but it's something that is an ongoing resource for political mobilization, identity formation, all that. So it may be that not simply American, it may be something more broadly about the way communities construct their identities, the way they construct them against other communities, and the way that they elevate certain figures in that process. It's something to, the world is so messy that there's something about an individual story that has a sort of stark death component to it that kind of is important. Yeah, oh, okay, here and then we'll go here. Mhm.
On one hand, you have that very much that like this was another act of brutality, but then another side, nation, and criminal in that way.
Mhm. Well, I think the other to speak to the IRA thing for a moment, there are unionists in the north of Ireland who take as their martyrs people who died at the hands of the IRA, right? And so there's a similar things going on. I had something else I was going to say about that. And so I was going to say, what's interesting, I think, and this will all remains to be seen how this comes out. Often I'd say there are very few people who would be considered martyrs by like the nation. And the process by which that happened, this is like chapter, I don't know, 8 or something, is that they often get shorn of a lot of their most distinctive characteristics. Think about Martin Luther King, right? The version that you get in sort of in King Holiday and so on is a version of Martin Luther King. It's like 1963 at the Lincoln Memorial and content of their character, right? And all the other stuff just kind of drops off. And when you want to bring that stuff in, it's like, well, now you're being divisive. So there's a way in which the starkness of a martyr's memory, I think, is at its most powerful within the sort of the subgroup that elevates. And then there are a figure, I mean, it's another one, right? Where when they get to the extent that they enter into like a national level, they may look rather different than they looked when they first died. And that's simply part of you can lament it perhaps, but it's simply part of the process. I'm not sure if I answered your question, but it reminded me of something else that was really interesting. Thank you. Oh, okay. Okay. Always somebody. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right? The question is, who are the because the Christian martyrs, they have a ministry once in a while.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, always have.
Right? So we have like
yeah.
But there's something else beyond that. And I wonder, one deals with personal being always at the moment, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's really two characteristic in our human moment.
Right.
I want to talk to you about the bigger, the martyrdom in politics. Like, what does martyrdom do? Not just to the political moments that utilize and raise them up, but what makes them have staying power and what is their effect?
That's all. That's it. Yeah. Well, you know, I think that in the specific cases here, of course, we're going to find out. But I would sort of come back to what I was saying a moment ago. I think there's there's something about the meaning of the death of Martin Luther King, for example, take an example, means something very different to members of different communities and did from the beginning. To the degree that, so the one way to put this in the strongest form is that there is a kind of sanitization that goes on. There's a kind of trade-off, maybe like I don't know, a couple of my students here, they've seen me try to draw graphs on the board in political theory classes. It doesn't end well. But there's some kind of trade-off perhaps between the kind of power that the immediate community that sort of would claim such a martyr and the entry into kind of a more generic or large scale community, that there's a kind of, there's a distinctiveness that gets chipped away or lost. And they become more of a canvas on which the center projects itself. Maybe I'm just sort of thinking out loud here, but I think that there is something very different about the Martin Luther King you get on Martin Luther King Day. And I think there's something, and it may be that if you stuck with the historical Martin Luther King, especially by the time he was shot, you wouldn't get that national martyr. And that may be a good thing, or may not be a good thing, whatever. But there's some kind of process by which broader, I don't say acceptance or broader toleration of it does lead to it to be transformed. Maybe let's leave it there. But yeah, it's a complicated mess. Thank you very much. Thank you for all these questions. Oh,